They say humiliation doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it walks in on heels, holding champagne, smiling like it belongs. That's how it greeted me that evening. Not with shouting or scandal, but with quiet, coordinated cruelty wrapped in white roses and golden tablecloths. The engagement party of my sister-in-law-to-be was being held in a rented garden hall on the edge of town, full of laughter, music, and people pretending to care about each other. I was invited late, as always, and when I arrived, everything already felt too full. Too perfect, too staged. But I smiled. I wore my dark green civilian dress uniform, polished boots, hair tied back, posture exact, not to show off, but because I had come straight from an armed forces ceremony, where I had been tasked with mentoring new cadets. I was still carrying the weight of their hopeful eyes when I stepped into that hall. And that's when it began. There was no one at the welcome table, so I scanned the name tags myself. One by one, I saw them. Aunt Susan, Cousin Mark, Grandma Eileen, Maid of Honor. I kept looking, expecting something simple. Carla, maybe, or Captain Vega. But when I finally found mine, the blood in my face went cold. A small white tag crookedly printed that read, Housemaid. No last name. No rank, just that. As if my existence had been stripped down to a function. I blinked once. Then again. The letters didn't change, my hands didn't tremble. Years of command had trained that out of me. But my breath did catch, not from shock, but from recognition. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a typo. This was a message. I turned to the nearest staffer, a young man arranging silverware, and asked where my seat was. He scanned the list. Then he hesitated and pointed vaguely toward the back. There's a small table near the kitchen entrance, ma'am. I think that one's yours. I walked through the room like a ghost. Faces turned toward me, eyes full of that shallow social smile that doesn't quite reach the soul. I saw my sister-in-law, glowing in white chiffon, laugh too loudly at something my husband whispered in her ear. He hadn't seen me yet. Neither had his mother, the matriarch of this glittering empire of passive aggression. She was busy pointing at floral arrangements and adjusting her daughter's train. When I finally reached the table, I stopped. There was no chair, not one, just a folded card that said staff break area, and beside it, a lukewarm bottle of water and a plate with 2 buttered rolls. That was it. No silverware, no napkin, no wine glass. I stood there waiting for someone, anyone, to notice. But they didn't. Or maybe they did. And that was the point. I turned slowly, walking back through the crowd toward the central table where my husband now stood with a glass of red wine, laughing. I stopped just short of him. He finally noticed me. His eyes scanned me head to toe, not with love, but with calculation. Ah, he said dryly, lifting his glass. There she is, I handed him the name tag. He took one glance, smirked, and shrugged. Bit on the nose, huh? You've been running around so much lately. Work, base, helping with the wedding stuff. Guess someone got confused. It's not a mistake, I said, voice flat. He chuckled. Babe, it's just a tag. Don't make it weird. We're here to celebrate. Then came the sentence that shifted the ground under my boots. You'll eat later, right? Food's just for family right now. I stared at him. At the man who, just 3 years earlier, had cried as I returned from deployment. The man who once called me his hero. Now he couldn't offer me a plate. I didn't say a word. I looked around the table, at the seated cousins, the clinking glasses, the curated playlist, the perfectly lit centerpieces. And I understood something very clear. I was no longer one of them. That's when his mother turned toward me, holding a flute of champagne like a queen bored with ceremony. She glanced at the tag still dangling in his fingers and raised her brow. Well, she said, smirking, technically you are staff, aren't you? Always busy doing something. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was soft, social, sharp, the kind of laughter that cuts deeper because it pretends not to. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I reached up with both hands, removed my military lapel pin, tucked it into my pocket, and stared at my husband. I want you to hear this, I said calmly. Because I'm only going to say it once. He straightened, suddenly unsure. I pulled off my wedding ring, the one I wore through 3 tours, the one that survived sandstorms and silent prayers, and placed it gently on the edge of the table between us. If I'm not family enough to have a seat or a meal, I said, then I'm not your wife. His face changed. Fast. The smirk vanished. He reached for my hand, but I had already turned. I didn't storm out. I walked, with the same posture I used in military parades. Head up, shoulders firm, heart steady. No one followed. I stepped out into the cool evening air and let the silence fall around me like armor. My car was parked at the far end of the lot. As I unlocked it, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A new email. I almost ignored it. But something made me check. It was from Lieutenant Kohler Ramirez. Subject line. RE Strategic Placement Deployment. Confirmed interest? I opened it. Captain Vega, if you're still interested in the Field Ops Intelligence role, we have an opening. High-level clearance. Quiet placement. Base relocation covered. You were our first choice. Let me know by Monday. I read it twice. Then again. And I smiled. Because while they were inside celebrating fairy tales, I had just remembered who I really was. Not their housemaid, not their shadow. A soldier. A strategist. A woman with choices, and I was about to make one they'd never see coming. I didn't drive home that night. I drove to a place where home once was. A parking lot overlooking the training fields of the southeastern base where I had earned my stripes, where my boots first left prints on muddy gravel that reeked of oil and wet grass, where the early mornings began with cold air and heavier expectations. I parked facing the darkness, turned off the ignition, and sat in stillness as the engine cooled. The military had always given me clarity, routine, a sense of consequence. Every choice had weight, every action a ripple, and every mistake a name. But what I had just experienced didn't belong to the rules of combat or protocol. It was something colder. A kind of assassination you can't see coming because the weapon is civility and the bullet is dressed like etiquette. And my mother-in-law had been aiming for years. It hadn't started at the engagement party. That was simply her crescendo. The moment she stepped forward and played the final note of a melody she had been composing since the day her son introduced me. Years ago, as his girlfriend who served in the army. I remember the smile on her face. Tight, polite, more muscle than warmth. She had said, "How brave," and then, just as quickly, turned to her other son to ask how the stocks were doing. I had chalked it up to nerves. Later, I would understand that it was the beginning of a war she intended to win without firing a single visible shot. In the months that followed, her micro-expressions did more damage than open insult. Every time I showed up in uniform, she'd glance at my boots as if measuring the dirt they might bring into her spotless world. Every dinner at her house, she'd find a way to make a joke about how intense I must be, or how it must be hard for a man like my husband to feel relaxed next to someone so disciplined. On the surface, they sounded like remarks, amused, harmless, but they stacked like sandbags on my back. I would laugh politely, not out of agreement, but because the battlefield wasn't mine. She had built it, she owned the terrain, and I was always the foreign element. My husband, Elliot, rarely intervened. He'd pat my leg under the table, whisper, "Ignore her," or make a weak attempt to change the subject. But ignoring her didn't erase the look in her eyes, the satisfaction that bloomed whenever I was forced to swallow my rank like it was salt water. Over time, even Elliot began to adopt her phrasing. When I returned from a 10-day field training once, exhausted and sunburned, the first thing he said was, "You should have called first. Mom came over and said the house looked like a storm hit it." He didn't ask how I was. He asked about the towels she claimed I had folded wrong. That was the shift, slow and unannounced. The woman I had married, who once wore my dog tags around her neck and said they made her feel protected, began to echo the voices of those who had never accepted me. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner when my career came up. Not because anyone asked, but because I had gotten promoted to captain. I hadn't planned on mentioning it, but when Elliot's brother began bragging about a mid-level banking certification he received, Elliot blurted, "Carla just made captain." The room fell into a hush, only broken by the sound of silverware tapping ceramic. My mother-in-law sipped her wine and said, "Well, we all serve in our own way. Some of us at dinner tables, some of us at desks, some wherever." I waited for her to finish the sentence, but she never did. That silence had meaning, and we all felt it. Later that night, when I asked Elliot about it, he shrugged and said, "Don't be sensitive. You know how she is." I didn't respond, because if I had, it would have been too loud, too emotional, too everything she could later use against me. When my sister-in-law, Marissa, got engaged, I congratulated her sincerely. I even offered to help with logistics. My experience organizing troop deployments and training schedules meant I could coordinate 20 vendors before breakfast. But instead of appreciation, I was met with avoidance. "It's all under control," they'd say. "You're busy. Military stuff?" They made it sound like I was orbiting another planet, not standing in the same kitchen, offering real help. I eventually stopped offering. The week before the engagement party, I was added to a group chat with a dozen names and no introductions. It included the event planner, caterer, decorator, and me, though no one addressed me directly. The one message I received was a forwarded PDF from my mother-in-law labeled Staff Guidance Document. I opened it and found a seating chart, color-coded with a section marked Support Roles, highlighted in gray. Next to my name, Auxiliary, no last name. No military title. Just that auxiliary I called Elliot. He was working late again, and when I asked him about the chart, he sighed. "She's just trying to organize things." "Don't read into it. It says I'm support staff. Maybe she meant you're part of the team helping with setup. You always take charge anyway." "Elliot, I'm not part of the catering crew. I'm your wife." There was a pause. Then he said, "You know what she's like. Just let it go." That sentence haunted me more than any insult. "You know what she's like." As if her disrespect was a force of nature I had to weather, not a decision she made repeatedly. I didn't push further. I had learned not to. Every protest turned into a character flaw. Every request to be seen turned into a melodrama. I kept my mouth shut and planned my outfit like I would a mission, meticulously, deliberately, expecting resistance. And that resistance arrived in full regalia on the day of the party. I recognized it not only in the name tag, but in the way her gaze slid right through me as I entered, as if I were a shadow on the wall. Her voice, loud enough to carry but quiet enough to seem innocent, wrapped itself around guests as she told them how proud she was of Marissa, how blessed they were as a family. She didn't mention Elliot. She certainly didn't mention me. It was when I walked past her to return the tag that she delivered the blow. Not in anger, but in amused detachment. "You should be used to that title by now," she said, eyes glinting. "I mean, what are you always doing if not cleaning up everyone's messes?" I looked at her. Really looked. Her pearls, her champagne flute, her perfectly curled hair. She had created a world so airless, so curated, that no woman like me could breathe inside it unless I choked down my identity entirely. And she expected me to do just that, to thank her for the privilege of being insulted in heels and satin. But she didn't expect what came next. She didn't expect that I had already packed a bag. That I had already made a decision days earlier when I opened that deployment offer. That I had already spoken to my commanding officer about transferring to a more remote post, one that would take me far from the suburbs and closer to purpose. She didn't know I had been mapping my escape like an operation, calculating the emotional terrain, noting weak points, gathering quiet intel. Because what no one in that room understood was that I had never been trained to fight with fists or fire. I had been trained to outlast sieges, and this was one. So when she said, "You're just staff," I smiled. And when Elliot laughed at the remark and turned away, I didn't flinch because they had written my name in lowercase letters, but I knew how to sign it in full rank with ink that didn't fade. And this war? It was already lost for them. They just hadn't realized who surrendered first. The silence in our house that night wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the kind that follows a detonation. Thick, eerie, full of suspended dust. I walked in alone, carrying nothing, not even the ring that had once marked the place where I belonged. The lights were off except for one in the hallway, which flickered faintly from a bulb that no one had bothered to replace. I left it as it was. The imperfection felt honest, unlike the curated perfection I had just walked out of. The hallway seemed longer than usual, as if the walls had stretched to match the distance I now felt between myself and the man who once promised to stand beside me when the world turned cruel. The man who used to trace the calluses on my palms like they were medals. The man who had kissed my forehead the morning I shipped out for my first deployment, whispering, "Come back safe, I need you." Now he laughed while they mocked me, sat comfortably among them as they stripped my name down to staff, and watched my place at the table disappear without so much as a word in protest. And the worst part wasn't that he didn't stop them. It was that he laughed. Not nervously, not because he didn't know what else to do, but because in that moment he agreed. I passed the kitchen and saw the wine bottle still open on the counter. The same one we had bought together in Italy, years ago when things felt new. When he would hold my hand in public and look at me like I was something luminous. Now it was half empty, the cork beside it and 2 glasses in the sink, one of them with lipstick that wasn't mine. That detail didn't surprise me as much as it should have. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need evidence to confirm what my instincts had already filed under classified truth. I walked past it like a soldier steps over debris in a war zone, not with denial, but with resignation. I climbed the stairs slowly, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel the weight of each step. I wanted to remind myself that I still had mass, still had presence, still had form, despite being treated like a shadow. Our bedroom door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, the blue light catching the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we met. He looked up, startled, as if he didn't expect me to return so soon. "Or at all. You left," he said, like it was an accusation, like I was the one who had disrupted the narrative. "I did," I replied, my voice flat but steady. He stood, setting the phone on the nightstand like he was about to step into a role he hadn't rehearsed properly. "Carla, come on." It was a joke. "You're taking this too seriously." I didn't sit. I didn't cry. I crossed my arms and asked, "You think it was funny?" He hesitated, which told me everything. Then he said, "They were just playing around. My mom's always been like that. You know that." "No," I said slowly. "What I know is that you let them erase me." "Erase you?" he repeated, incredulous. "You're being dramatic." That word cracked something inside me. Dramatic. As if I were some fragile pageant queen stomping off because her tiara tilted. Not a woman who had stood through sandstorms with a rifle slung over her shoulder, had patched wounds under fire, had held the trembling hands of recruits on their first night out of home. I wanted to ask him if he remembered the time he got pneumonia, and I carried him down 2 flights of stairs when he couldn't walk. Or the time I flew back from overseas on emergency leave just to sit beside his father's hospital bed, so he wouldn't have to mourn alone. I wanted to list the sacrifices, tally the miles I had marched in his name, the holidays I had missed to make our future possible. But I didn't, because it wouldn't matter. Not to someone who had already decided I was too much to stand next to in a room full of people who preferred their women soft-spoken and ornamental. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like a man trying to coax a child. "You know how these events go. They're formal. They have categories. You're not blood. I'm your wife," I said, not loudly, but sharply enough to cut through whatever illusion he was about to offer next. "Were," he said without thinking, then flinched as if he had heard the word too late. I stared at him, and something inside me stopped breathing. "Carla," he began, voice softening. "I didn't mean—" "Yes," I interrupted. "You did." He looked away, running a hand through his hair. That nervous tick I used to find endearing. "Look, you've changed. You're different. Always gone. Always intense. It's hard to connect sometimes. And my family doesn't respect me," I finished for him. "But that's not the problem. The problem is that you don't." There was a long silence between us, broken only by the hum of the ceiling fan. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a counter. He just stood there, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging between us like fog. I walked to the closet and grabbed the duffel I kept ready, not for dramatic exits, but because habit dies hard when you've lived half your life on bases. I didn't pack fast. I took what I needed. A few changes of clothes, my paperwork, my medals tucked in a velvet pouch, the small photograph of my father that had survived 3 assignments and a fire. As I zipped the bag, he spoke again, this time without conviction. "So that's it? You're just leaving?" I paused, then turned to him. "You already left," I said. "You just forgot to pack." I walked out, my boots echoing against the hardwood, each step loud enough to make a memory. He didn't follow. And that told me more than any apology would have. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I didn't play music. I drove in silence, headed toward the motel near the base, the same one I'd stayed in during my last off-duty weekend. The manager remembered me, gave me the corner room, said nothing about the fact that I didn't smile. I went inside, placed the duffel by the bed, and sat down slowly, feeling the echo of everything I'd left behind. Not just a house, not just a husband, but the version of me who had hoped he'd defend her. I checked my email again. The message from Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez was still there. I hit reply, confirmed, I accept the placement. Please advise next steps. I sent it. Then I stood, walked to the bathroom, and washed my hands like I was scrubbing off the residue of someone else's dream. The woman in the mirror looked back with tired eyes, but not broken ones. She wasn't erased. She was emerging. I turned off the light and let the darkness settle, because sometimes the only way to reclaim yourself is to be willing to let everything else burn. The next morning didn't come with sunlight or warmth. It came with a dull gray sky and the kind of wind that felt like it was searching for loose skin to bite. I woke up in the motel room with my eyes already open, as if sleep had only briefly borrowed me from the weight of my own body. The sheets were stiff, the pillowcase rough against my cheek, but it was the silence that felt strangest of all. No footsteps from upstairs, no notifications pinging from a shared calendar, no one clearing their throat to remind me I was too much, too loud, too military to belong. Just stillness, and the faint humming of a vending machine down the hall. I sat up slowly, every joint registering the change of life terrain, no longer in my home. No longer anyone's wife, no longer the soldier who built her entire off-duty life around the fragile idea of being accepted as both strong and soft. I stretched my legs over the edge of the bed and stared at the duffel bag in the corner. It sat like a loyal animal, zipped and ready, waiting for orders. Orders I now had the freedom to give. The moment I took off my ring the night before, it wasn't a gesture. It was a declaration. It didn't bounce or clink or roll. It landed with a weight that wasn't just metal, it was finality. For years, that ring had been a circle of compromise, a loop I kept tracing with my thumb whenever I felt invisible. I had worn it through deployments and debriefs, kept it on while dressing wounds and carrying rifles. But when I placed it on the edge of that perfectly decorated engagement table, it was like handing back a lie I had been complicit in. I didn't belong to him anymore, not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer wanted to plead for visibility. That ring had become the symbol of a pact I signed alone. In the motel, I showered with hot water until my skin turned pink. Not because I was dirty, but because I wanted to feel the sting of a new beginning. I dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a black sweater, no insignias, no sharp lines, just fabric on skin. I stared at myself in the mirror above the sink and realized I looked unfamiliar. Not because I had changed, but because I had been staring at a masked version of myself for so long that seeing the real one felt jarring. There was no one to salute, no one to answer to, no one to perform for. Just me and the silence and the freedom to decide what came next. I checked my phone. 11 missed calls from Elliot. 2 from his mother. 1 from Marissa. The messages were all the same flavor of condescension dipped in sugar. "Let's talk. This got out of hand. You're being rash. We didn't mean to hurt you. Come back and let's figure it out. Not a single one said, we're sorry. Not a single one said, we were wrong. Just an avalanche of emotional summons, each one demanding I re-enter a system that only wanted me when I was silent and useful. I deleted all of them. I made myself coffee from the packet in the room and sat by the window, sipping slowly, as if reclaiming time itself. I stared at the parking lot, watching strangers come and go. No one knew my name, no one knew my rank. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel lesser because of it. I felt invisible in the best way, free from expectation, free from control, free from the eyes that had followed me like searchlights in my own home. Later that afternoon, I drove to a military surplus store off the highway, not because I needed gear, but because it was familiar ground. I walked the aisles slowly, touching canvas and metal, letting my fingers graze over materials that had once defined me. I passed a rack of used field uniforms, each one with a name tag stitched over the chest, most of them faded, a few torn. I stopped and stared at them for a long while. Rows of people who had been something, somewhere. Levs marked by initials and service branches. I thought about mine. Vega, still crisp, still mine. But I didn't miss the title, not here. Not now. As I exited, the man at the register nodded toward me. He had a beard and a limp, and eyes that had seen what most people ran from. Ma'am, he said. Not miss, not lady, not you. I nodded back. Respect doesn't need volume. Back in the car, I checked my email again. A reply from Lieutenant Collier Ramirez. He welcomed me to the new assignment, confirmed the transfer, and sent preliminary documents. The deployment would be longer than usual, quiet, strategically sensitive. Not combat, but analysis and systems testing for a new operations program. Remote, isolated, clean slate. Exactly what I needed. I accepted without hesitation. I would be leaving in 3 days. The military had always known my value, even when my own husband had forgotten it. That evening, Elliot showed up at the motel. He knocked twice and called my name. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it, calm and firm. What do you want? He hesitated, then said, to talk. We did that. I said everything I needed to say. He sighed, the way men sigh when they're not used to women walking away. Can I come in? No. Carla, please. I waited. You're blowing this out of proportion. It was a party, a joke. I didn't mean for it to go like that. Then what did you mean? Silence. I don't know. He finally said, that's the problem. Another pause. Come home. I don't live there anymore. Please, I miss you. No, you miss what I gave you. What I cleaned up. What I carried. I didn't laugh at you, he lied. I saw your face. You laughed. It was just a moment. No, it was a decision. He said nothing. I could hear the shift in his breath, the beginning of a plea. But it was too late. The spell had broken. The man behind the door wasn't my husband anymore. He was a stranger asking for access to someone he no longer knew how to see. Carla, goodbye. Elliot. I turned off the light. He stayed a few more minutes, then left. I waited until I heard the car pull away before I sat on the bed again, staring at the wall as if it might answer the question I hadn't asked. Why did I wait so long to walk away? But I knew, because I had hoped, and hope is a slow poison when planted in the wrong soil. I took the ring out of my pocket, held it in my palm. It looked smaller now, like it had shrunk under the weight of everything it couldn't hold. I walked to the vending machine down the hall, dropped it inside the coin return tray, and walked away. Let someone else find it. Let them imagine the story. I owed no explanations anymore. The next morning, I began to prepare for departure. I notified the housing office. I signed the transfer papers. I packed my duffel with clinical precision. There was no ceremony, no grief, just movement. I left behind the apartment keys in an envelope at the front desk. No note. Before leaving the city, I made one final stop. The base cemetery. I stood before my father's grave, the man who taught me never to bow to people who confuse kindness with weakness. I left. "Dad," I whispered. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the granite. He always told me, "Don't let anyone demote you in your own life." And for the first time, I felt like I had finally earned my rank, not on paper, but in spirit. I saluted, then I turned and walked forward. The engine hummed steadily as I left the city behind, the road unfolding before me in quiet gray ribbons that offered no commentary, no judgment, just direction. I didn't plug in music. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even glance at the GPS. I knew the road to the base like I knew the layout of every house I'd lived in but never really belonged to. I could have driven it with my eyes closed. It was the road I had driven back and forth during every leave, every holiday, every moment I tried to make someone else's life more comfortable while shrinking my own into carry-ons and Sunday dinners full of small talk and strategic silences. This time, though, it wasn't a round trip. This wasn't a pause before returning to the role I'd been assigned. This was a severance, clean and unflinching, like a blade sliding between cartilage. I wasn't leaving for deployment. I was leaving for myself, as I passed familiar intersections, gas stations, the rusted-out billboard that still read, "Serving those who serve." I thought about how many times I had taken this road in uniform, watched other drivers glance at my shoulder patches, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with suspicion. I thought about the man I had once married, who used to drive this very stretch with me, fingers laced through mine, windows down, music playing. He used to say, "This base looks like nowhere," but it brought me you. And I believed him, even after the first time he flinched when I raised my voice too much in a conversation, or when he asked me not to talk about my job around his mother's friends because it made them uncomfortable. I believed him when he said he loved how strong I was, even though he started calling me intense after we moved in together. I believed him when he said he was proud, right up until he laughed while I stood beside a table with no plate, wearing a name tag that said I was furniture. The miles peeled away beneath the tires like old skin. The landscape blurred into a mixture of memory and dust. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for gas. I just kept going, as if movement alone could cauterize the part of me that still felt tender. I was halfway to the base when the first signs of rain appeared, not heavy, not cinematic, just a light drizzle that smeared the windshield with gentle defiance. The kind of rain that doesn't cleanse anything, just reminds you that the sky's been holding back. I flicked on the wipers and adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit. There was nothing behind me but a long trail of places I no longer owed loyalty to. I reached the motel on the edge of town just as the rain stopped. It was an old building, 2 stories, shaped like a horseshoe, the kind of place that smelled faintly of bleach and forgotten plans. I checked into a room on the 2nd floor, paid in cash, gave a fake last name. Not because I feared being found, but because I had no desire to be named by anyone for the time being. The woman at the counter asked if I was military. I nodded. She offered a small discount and a room with a view of the field behind the building, where the grass grew wild and untamed, and no one had bothered to fence it in. It felt fitting. The room was simple. A bed, a table, a lamp that flickered once when I turned it on, then steadied itself as if regaining balance. I dropped my bag at the foot of the bed and sat down, letting the silence settle over my shoulders like a coat. The quiet was different here. Not empty, but calm, like the silence of a field after target practice, when the last shot has echoed and the air still rings from the memory of force. I pulled out my phone and opened the email app without thinking. The message from Lieutenant Colin Ramirez was still there, blinking quietly like a door I hadn't stepped through yet. I opened it again, read the same lines I had already memorized. "Captain Vega, we're moving fast on this placement. It's a small team. High discretion. We'd be lucky to have you." I read the part that mattered most again. High discretion. Small team. That meant no public ceremonies, no mandatory dinners, no posed pictures. Just work, just purpose, just structure. After a year of watching my personal life turn into theater, complete with assigned roles, unwanted scripts, and audiences that watched with judgment instead of empathy. I wanted nothing more than to disappear into something where everything meant what it said. I hit reply. I wrote a single sentence. I accept the assignment. Send the documentation. I stared at it for a moment before pressing send. There was no flutter of doubt, no aching in the chest, no pull from any place I had left behind. It felt like releasing a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for the past 3 years. Moments later, the response arrived. Understood. Welcome aboard. Paperwork attached. Travel dates locked. We'll see you Monday. My fingers moved quickly over the files, signing what needed signing, scanning through maps, schedules, coordinates. It felt good, mechanical, controlled. There were no blurred lines in this job. You were either in or out, deployed or dismissed, assigned or rejected. And for the first time in too long, I had chosen the mission before someone else chose it for me. That night, I laid on the bed, arms folded under my head, staring at the ceiling tiles that carried faint stains of a past storm. I thought about my sister-in-law, still twirling in her white dress, still laughing with her mother about how some women just don't know their place. I thought about the table I never sat at, the plate I never touched, the man who stood beside me and chose not to see me. I thought about the ring still sitting in the vending machine tray, maybe already picked up by someone else, maybe still there, waiting for the next woman who forgot herself for too long. And then I thought about the deployment, what it would mean to be gone, to be needed, to be somewhere my silence didn't make me disappear but made me stronger. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A new number. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. This one I recognized, Elliot. I turned off the phone. I didn't need to hear another attempt at revisionist history. The kind where people cry not because they regret what they did, but because they lost control of the narrative. I didn't need to be begged back into a space that had labeled me a servant. I didn't want a seat at a table built on pretense. I wanted my own table, my own silence, my own name. The next morning, I folded my clothes tightly, military precise, corners sharp, lines even. I packed only what I needed. I left the rest behind. I left the motel key at the front desk and thanked the woman who had offered the view of the field. She nodded and handed me a small paper cup of coffee. It wasn't good, but it was warm. I drank it slowly. The base wasn't far. 10 minutes along a 2-lane road flanked by trees that didn't care who I used to be. The gate guard saluted when he saw my ID. He didn't comment on how long I'd been gone or why I wasn't in uniform yet. He just nodded and let me through. And that, somehow, meant more than all the empty words I'd heard from people who once claimed to love me. I checked into the operations building, met with Ramirez, signed more papers. He didn't ask about my personal life. He didn't mention the party or the name tag or the man I'd walked away from. He just handed me my badge and said, "Glad to have you." That was it. I was shown to my quarters, a small, efficient space with a twin bed, a desk, a cabinet. No frills, no lace, no one else's perfume on the pillowcases. I unpacked in silence. Then I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. In the stillness, I wrote, not a letter. Not a goodbye. Just a single sentence. I never needed a seat at your table. I was building my own. I saved it. Not to send, just to remember, because memory, when cleaned of noise, becomes armor, and I had just begun to put mine back on. The first ring came at 5:47 a.m., when the sky was still a muted blue and the air smelled like metal and old stone, like the breath of a world still stretching awake. I had just laced my boots, the cadence of routine as automatic as heartbeat, when the vibration started low and insistent against the metal desk. I ignored it. It wasn't an emergency line. It wasn't base protocol. It was a name that no longer held rank in my world, just static in the background of a life I no longer claimed. I let it ring out, but it didn't stop. 3 minutes later again. Then 8. Then 12. As if the silence I had chosen was unacceptable. As if the people I had left behind needed to drag me back to the version of myself that made them feel safe and in control. The calls were like flares from a burning ship I had already swum away from, loud, bright, desperate, but I didn't look back. I had spent too many years being their life raft. By mid-morning, there were 12 missed calls from Elliot and 4 from his mother. One from an unknown number I knew by instinct was his sister. I could feel the cracks in their polished surface starting to widen. They were scrambling, not because they missed me, but because they realized something had shifted in the architecture of their world. I was no longer orbiting them, no longer serving as the quiet, dependable gravitational pull that kept their illusion intact. I had become a void they couldn't fill with sarcasm or guilt, and they couldn't stand it. I walked out of my assigned room and into the main operations building, the weight of the phone heavy in my jacket pocket. I kept it there, untouched, muted. The briefing that morning was short and pointed. I was given a seat at the table, not the edge, not the back row, but directly across from Lieutenant Colonel Ramirez, who addressed me by rank and last name without hesitation or delay. There were no asterisks next to my presence. No condescending glances. No one asked if I needed help understanding the acronyms on the screen. They assumed I already knew, and I did. The room was clean and bright and quiet, filled with the hum of machines and the sharp scratch of pens against paper. It felt like breathing in real air after years of being told to smile while suffocating. After the briefing, I was handed a stack of files. No one asked if I had plans that evening. No one assumed I'd be the one bringing coffee. I returned to my quarters, spread the documents out across the bed, and began to read. The work was dense, technical, absorbing. It asked something of me, and in asking, it respected what I could offer. The phone buzzed again at 2:06 p.m., then at 2:10, then 2:19. A storm of attempted access. I placed it in the drawer and shut it, not angrily, but with finality. I had already left, and they were just now realizing it. That was not my emergency to resolve. In the late afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the base, a habit I'd started years ago to clear my mind between shifts. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows against the gravel path, and I walked with the kind of clarity that comes only when you've survived being turned into a ghost. I thought about the dinner tables where I had been invisible, the weekends I'd sacrificed, the cold glances that had followed every time I mentioned deployment or training or military structure. I thought about how often I had been asked to shrink so others could feel tall. I thought about how silence had once been my offering, and how now it was my refusal. Back in my room, I opened the drawer again and looked at the screen. 17 missed calls. 3 voicemails. A text. We need to talk. This isn't like you. That was Elliot. The text before that had been, can you please answer just once? And before that, you're being unfair. I stared at those words. Not with anger, but with a kind of quiet fascination. Unfair. As if fairness had been part of the deal when I stood in a room full of people who looked at me like I was the hired help. As if fairness had existed when I watched my husband laugh at my exclusion. As if my silence now was more damaging than their mockery then. I didn't respond. I opened the first voicemail. Elliot's voice soft, urgent. Carla, I know things got out of hand. I know that party was... I know I should have said something. But I didn't think it would... Please, just talk to me. The second voicemail was longer, rambling. I miss you. I miss us. You're not picking up. I don't know where you are. Your stuff's still here. Your shoes. Your books. It feels like you just disappeared. Is this really what you want? Is this who you are now? And the last voicemail, the shortest. A single sentence. I hope you're proud of yourself. That one I saved. I didn't save it out of sentiment. I saved it as proof. Of the moment when guilt transformed into blame. Of the moment when the person who watched me vanish at his side now resented me for walking away on my own. It was the clearest indicator that I had made the right choice. When you begin to rebuild your life and someone who claimed to love you accuses you of betrayal for not crumbling in front of them, you know you were never really loved. You were managed, framed, projected upon. The next day, the calls slowed. They trickled instead of flooded. A text from Marissa that read, "Mom's really upset. Can you just let her explain?" Another from Elliot. "I talked to your base. They wouldn't tell me anything." That one made me exhale through my nose, a dry, humorless sound. The idea that he thought the military would give up my location to a man who let his mother put a housemaid label on my chest was absurd. I wanted to send him a list of emergency protocols. I wanted to teach him the difference between access and entitlement. But I didn't. That evening, I was assigned a test scenario, a simulation designed to assess cognitive speed under stress. I completed it in half the projected time. Ramirez glanced at the results, looked up, and said, "You've still got it." I nodded. I didn't need praise, just acknowledgement, just accuracy. After the session, I walked back to my room in the dark. The air was cooler now, the kind that carried the promise of colder seasons ahead. I passed a new recruit sitting alone on a bench, his eyes tired, his hands clenched. He nodded at me. I nodded back, no words. Just mutual understanding. I had once sat there too. In my room, I opened the drawer again. The phone buzzed once, then stopped. A new message appeared on the screen. "You're being cruel. We're family." I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I simply wrote a reply, typed slowly with both thumbs, carefully, deliberately, like filling out an official report. Family doesn't put a woman in uniform at a table without a plate. Family doesn't laugh when you're erased. You lost the right to call me that. I hit send. Then I turned off the phone. Permanently. I sat on the bed and pulled my legs up, wrapping my arms around my knees, not out of fear, but out of centering. I thought about how silence had once been my prison. Now it was my fortress. A place I chose where I could breathe without permission, where I didn't have to perform forgiveness for people who didn't know how to ask for it. I thought about how long I had been trying to earn a seat in someone else's story, when I had always been writing my own. And as the moon rose over the base, casting faint light across the floor, I whispered, not out of spite, but with calm finality. The same words I had once said under my breath in a dark barrack. Years ago on the edge of sleep and survival, "I don't belong to anyone, not anymore." There was a kind of silence in the war room that didn't resemble stillness, but calculation. It was the silence of minds moving faster than mouths could catch up, the silence of pressure without panic, of intellect honed by necessity. I sat at the long steel table, the harsh overhead lights bouncing off maps and projection screens, while the air conditioners hummed like distant machinery. Around me, 6 officers and 2 intelligence analysts sifted through a situation no one had seen coming. Operation Iron Shelter had been classified even within classified circles, buried deep beneath layers of bureaucratic hush and data protocols that didn't tolerate curiosity. And yet I had been invited, no, assigned to sit at this table, to contribute, to lead. Not as someone's wife, not as a guest, not as a +1 or an afterthought, but as Captain Vega, tactical systems specialist, former ground unit commander, and one of the few in this region with both field and command clearance. They didn't care what color my dress was at a party. They cared about coordinates, intel, outcomes, and how to prevent lives from being lost in the wrong quadrant of an unstable zone. And for the first time in months, I felt my name click back into place, like a key finally meeting its proper lock. The situation was delicate. One of our humanitarian supply operations in an Allied territory had gone dark for 72 hours. Satellite imaging showed no conflict, no fire damage, no enemy movement. But on the ground, something was off. No signals, no personnel movement, no drone activity within the perimeter. 3 teams had rotated out of that post in the past 6 months, and I knew the names of at least 5 soldiers still there. Not just from reports, but from training cycles I had run, from hand-to-hand drills under pelting rain, from the kinds of conversations you only have with someone after you've both cleaned blood off a vehicle floor at midnight and still had to show up at morning PT. I knew their patterns. Their methods. I could read between the transmission logs like someone decoding body language. And something was wrong. Ramirez looked at me from the head of the table and said, We're authorizing a remote recon simulation using our Deep Shield protocols. Your lead. I didn't nod. I didn't thank him. I said, copy that, and pulled the tablet closer. The simulation room was cold and windowless, as most of them were, lit only by screens that wrapped around the walls like a cocoon of data. I suited up alone, fitted with the motion tracking rig, the sensory gloves, the retinal lens interface. I didn't need assistance. I had done this enough times to know which strap needed tightening before the system would start chirping. As the AI initialization sequence counted down, I let my breathing slow. In the final seconds before full immersion, my mind didn't drift to fear or failure or the implications of getting this wrong. It drifted unexpectedly to the engagement party, to the weight of the ring I had placed on that table, to the fork I had never been handed, and the laugh. His laugh. Light, dismissive, like the sound of a man brushing lint from his cuff while his wife was being buried alive in shame. The simulation began and I put it all away. Sealed behind mental armor, not forgotten. Just filed, because emotion couldn't lead this mission, but precision could. Inside the sim, I moved through a reconstruction of the field station, each section rendered in startling detail from the most recent data captures. Crates of rations, portable mid-units, folded cots, empty fire pits, no bodies, no heat signals, but something off in the pattern of the shadows, in the curvature of the tire tracks outside the gate, in the angle of the wind-blown debris. It didn't look ransacked. It looked abandoned, chosen, structured, as if someone had been told to vanish. And if that was the case, then the threat wasn't external, it was internal. A buried directive, a leak. Someone had flipped a switch, and those soldiers had gone dark not because they were taken, but because they had been told to disappear. I disengaged from the sim slowly, fingers tingling from prolonged glove pressure, eyes blinking against the room's sudden re-entry into reality. Ramirez was waiting. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer water or condolences. He simply said, "You saw it," I nodded. "Directive Echo 5. He exhaled. "We thought so." Echo 5 was a protocol buried beneath 4 layers of clearance. It authorized field withdrawal under pretext of environmental instability, but it was rarely used. Because its implication was simple. The mission is not to save. The mission is to erase. I looked at the printouts forming on the adjacent table. Personnel rosters. Code strings. I saw a name I recognized. Private Lim. I had written her a letter of recommendation 6 months ago. She was barely 20, and someone had decided she was better off unseen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam a hand on the table. I turned to Ramirez and said, "I want direct access to the Echo 5 trigger file." He raised an eyebrow. "That would require command override," I said. "Use my clearance." "I'm not asking." He didn't argue. He typed in the request. 5 minutes later, I had the file. I traced the authorizing IP back to a civilian node, a political liaison attached to one of our foreign aid partners. Not military, not trained, but powerful, connected. The kind of person who probably sat at tables like the one from that engagement party, swirling a glass of white wine while giving orders that made people like me disappear for convenience. Later that evening, I wrote the incident report, precise, cold, irrefutable. I submitted it to command, knowing it would be flagged, buried, maybe even ignored. But it was there now, and I knew how to make it move. I knew which journalists watched for military leaks. I knew which retired colonels couldn't resist a quiet whistle. I wasn't just trained in tactics. I was trained in systems, and I had been pushed out of too many rooms not to learn how to slip back in through the wiring. The next morning, Ramirez pulled me aside. "You know what you're doing." "Yes," I said. "And I'm not stopping." He didn't try to stop me. He just said, "Understood." And that, again, was all I needed. No performance. No apology. Just acknowledgement. That day, my name appeared at the top of the operations schedule. No questions. No eyebrows raised. Just respect, written in ink and reinforced by silence. That evening, alone in my quarters, I stared at the screen again. No new messages, no new missed calls. I imagined Elliot at home, or wherever he was, staring at the empty chair I had once filled, surrounded by people who were suddenly quieter now that their target had removed herself. I imagined Marissa posting curated photos, the ring on her finger catching just enough light to distract from the empty space behind her. I imagined his mother, staring at her wine glass and wondering when her version of control had slipped. None of them had expected me to disappear. They expected protest. They expected begging. They expected the kind of exit that could be rewritten as instability. But I hadn't given them that. I had given them silence, cold, surgical. And now all they had left was the echo of it. I pulled up the file directory on my base-issue laptop. I opened the personnel image from earlier that day. Private Lim, eyes wide, mouth caught in a moment between laughter and duty. I stared at her for a long time. Then I opened a blank file. And I wrote, "This is not a story of absence. It's a story of precision, of refusal, of names reclaimed, because names, like ranks, mean nothing if you allow them to be redefined by those who don't respect their weight. And I was done letting anyone rewrite mine." It began with a headline, not one designed to shock or provoke, but one that carried a kind of restrained weight that only certain words possess when spoken aloud on national television. "Honoring our hidden frontlines, a salute to silent operations." The screen faded from blue to white, and then her face appeared, not glamorized or framed with artificial warmth, but captured mid-command in an undisclosed outpost, hair tied tight, brows furrowed, one hand raised over a map table as if freezing a moment of calculation. In that frozen frame, she was no one's wife, no one's subordinate, no one's disappointment. She was Captain Vega, lead strategic analyst and field operations commander, honored for her role in re-establishing communication with the missing Iron Shelter Detachment, and for exposing a failed civilian directive that jeopardized 6 lives and compromised national security. The news anchor spoke with that slow, deliberate tone reserved for medals and funerals, pausing just long enough before pronouncing her rank to ensure that even those half-watching understood its significance. And on a beige couch in a brightly lit living room cluttered with decor and curated smiles, her family watched. Elliot sat stiff, one arm thrown over the backrest like he still had control over something. His mother, perched on the edge of her seat as if proximity might lessen the blow, blinked rapidly at the screen. Marissa stood in the archway, a fork still in her hand, her face contorted in a frozen attempt to look unimpressed, even though the color in her knuckles betrayed the effort. No one spoke. No one reached for the remote. No one could. Because the silence that fell over that room wasn't born of awe. It was the silence of people watching their carefully constructed narrative begin to collapse in real time. The footage continued. The camera panned to Ramirez, standing behind a podium during a ceremony closed to the public, but broadcast in fragments to trusted media. He recited details without dramatics. Captain Vega's leadership under internal obstruction and her ability to maintain operational clarity under suppressed communication protocols ensured the survival of every listed member of the missing unit. Her work also led to the arrest of 2 non-military assets attempting to manipulate supply records to redirect resources for profit. The words weren't dressed up. They didn't need to be. They were facts, verified, filed, sealed in reports and confirmed by chain of command. The kind of truth that no social media post, no family chat, no carefully staged photo of a table without her could erase. Marissa was the first to speak, though it wasn't a full sentence, just a soft, breathless sound. "They're exaggerating." It came out small, weak, an attempt to reassert dominance over a reality that no longer needed her approval. Elliot didn't respond. His gaze remained on the screen as the camera cut to a shot of Carla walking across the tarmac, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, posture rigid but not tense. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't waving. She was focused, grounded, present. His mother muttered something about how it was convenient timing, how the military always dramatized its heroes, How anyone could look important when filmed from below with the sun at their back. But the words felt brittle, performed as though each syllable cracked a little more of the armor they had tried to build against her absence. The segment ended with a brief excerpt from an off-camera interview, audio only. Carla's voice, low and steady, filled the room like smoke. You don't always get to choose how people see you, but you do get to choose what you walk away from. And sometimes that choice is the loudest thing you'll ever say. The screen faded to black. Then the anchor moved on, seamlessly, to another story about rising gas prices. But the living room remained frozen. In another house, several towns away, another screen had played the same segment. But in that home, the reaction was different. A woman in her 60s paused the recording and rewound it. She watched Carla's face again. Then again. She didn't know her personally, but she had known the feeling of being pushed to the edge of someone else's spotlight. She had known what it meant to give everything for a family and be thanked with silence. She reached for her phone and found the interview clip online. She forwarded it to her daughter with a message. Watch this. You'll understand why I cried. And in a base rec room, 3 junior officers watched the same video on a cracked laptop, replaying the audio clip and whispering to each other. She was the one who filed that report. One of them pulled up her personnel record. And within minutes, the mythos had begun to spread. Not as gossip, but as reverence. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need embellishment because the facts already held weight. Carla Vega had gone dark and come back with 6 people who didn't have to die. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone paying attention that invisibility and irrelevance were never the same thing. Back in the beige living room, the silence finally broke when Elliot stood up and left the room. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't look back. His mother called after him, but the words bounced off the walls like forgotten obligations. Marissa muttered something about how it wasn't over. But even she didn't sound convinced. The ring on her finger felt heavier than it had the day before. And she noticed for the first time how the framed photo of the engagement party didn't quite align on the shelf anymore. It tilted slightly to the left, like it was trying to escape the moment it had captured. Elliot sat alone in the bedroom for an hour before opening his phone. No new messages from Carla, no notifications, no photos, no digital breadcrumbs. He opened her old text thread. The last message she had sent him was 2 words. I'm done. Beneath it, a sea of unanswered blue bubbles. He typed a new message, then deleted it, then typed it again. I saw the news. I'm sorry. He stared at it, then erased it, then turned off the screen because some silences weren't meant to be broken. Some were earned. Back on base, Carla sat alone at her desk, filing the last of her mission notes. She hadn't seen the broadcast. She hadn't needed to. She knew what they would show, what they wouldn't, what would be said, and what would be carefully omitted. She didn't care. Recognition had never been her pursuit. Only clarity. And now, with every action logged, every file submitted, and every person saved accounted for, she leaned back and stared at the wall for a long time. She thought about how silence had once been her punishment. Now it was her reply, and this time everyone had heard it. It was a Sunday. The kind of Sunday that used to mean something. That used to smell like roast in the oven, and expectations in the air, like clinking silverware and careful conversation under chandeliers that gleamed too hard for people pretending too much. It was the kind of Sunday where family gathered not for affection, but for performance. Each person arriving like a character to a stage already set, hoping their presence meant they still mattered. In that house, large, cold in its perfection, still echoing with the shallow laughter of the engagement party no one dared mention, Marissa had prepared a dinner designed to assert order. Not love, order. The plates gleamed under dimmed lighting, the wine decanted in advance, the linen napkins folded into sharp peaks that looked ceremonial rather than welcoming. Elliot sat at the head of the table, silent. His mother sat on the right, sipping white wine that had long since lost its chill. The 4th chair remained empty. Not out of forgetfulness, not out of oversight, but because no one had the courage to fill it. No one dared put a new name where hers had once sat without permission. So it stayed there, like a wound they couldn't cauterize. Marissa tried to talk about headlines. Her voice carried the forced brightness of someone clinging to a script, each sentence landing like a paper plane that refused to fly. They're saying we might get early spring rains. Can you imagine? Her mother nodded, slow and detached, eyes still flicking to the television in the next room, muted but glowing faintly with the replay of a ceremony they could no longer ignore. Elliot said nothing. He hadn't said much in days, not since the phone calls stopped, not since the messages bounced back with a short system response, number no longer in service. It wasn't just that Carla had gone silent. It was that the silence had weight, finality, strategy. It wasn't retreat. It was repositioning, and they had no coordinates for it. The meal passed slowly. Forks scraped plates in stunted rhythm. The only sound of substance was the occasional sigh or clink of glass against marble. And then came the knock. It was quiet, deliberate, not urgent, the kind of knock that didn't beg or warn. It simply announced. Elliot stood first, slower than usual, like the air had thickened around his joints. His mother followed, as if proximity to whatever stood behind the door might give her back something she lost. Marissa remained seated, her fork halfway to her mouth, frozen mid-bite, eyes suddenly wider than they'd been all night. When Elliot opened the door, his breath caught for a moment. It wasn't Carla, not directly. It was a man in uniform. Navy blue courier service. Not government. Not private. The kind used for legal documents when discretion matters more than speed. The man didn't smile. He asked for Elliot by full name. Elliot confirmed. The man handed over a sealed envelope. Signature, please. Elliot signed without reading. The man nodded once, turned and left. No extra words. No glances. Just procedure. The envelope was thick, heavier than expected, and sealed with a wax emblem Elliot didn't recognize. He closed the door and walked back to the table where the silence now buzzed like static. He opened it with the edge of a butter knife. Inside were papers, legal, crisp, unforgiving. And on top a single note typed. No salutation. No closure. Just one line. This is not an act of anger. It's a return to equilibrium. Elliot scanned the contents. Property division. Bank withdrawals. Pension redirection. Asset closure. Legal dissolution finalized. Everything signed. Everything timed. Dated 2 weeks prior. While he was still leaving voicemails, Carla had been filing. While he was rewatching the news segment, she had been unthreading every legal tie. And attached to the back of the folder was a copy of their mortgage, signed over entirely to her name, and a confirmation of resale. The house was no longer theirs. It was sold. Quietly, effectively, strategically. The paperwork showed a transfer of proceeds to a trust under her name, with the remainder divided between 2 veterans organizations and a scholarship fund under her father's name. His mother reached for the papers, mouth already open to argue, to challenge, to refute, but Elliot held them tighter, his hands trembling now. He saw the notary stamps, the signatures, the authority codes, all legitimate, all final. Marissa stood now too, whispering, "What is that?" Elliot didn't answer. He sat back down in the empty chair, the one across from the space Carla used to fill, and placed the papers on the table like a centerpiece no one could remove. Across town, Carla sat in a cafe tucked between a library and a consulate. Her laptop was open. Her tea had long since cooled. She had no need to rush. No one was waiting. Her new quarters at the next base were ready, furnished with nothing but standard-issue necessities and a view of a quiet motor pool. She hadn't gone there yet. She liked the silence of transition. The in-between. She opened her inbox. An automatic notification confirmed the property closure had been delivered. Another confirmed the final deposit. She closed the laptop slowly, as if sealing off one final vault inside herself. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood and placed a folded note under her empty cup for the waiter. No words, just a tip. She left as quietly as she had arrived. That evening, her former house sat colder than usual, even with the heat on. Elliot hadn't turned on the lights. He sat in the kitchen, the documents spread out around him, his phone dark on the table. His mother had left shortly after reading the part about the pension separation. Marissa had gone upstairs in silence, her fork from earlier still lying on the placemat like a misplaced weapon. Elliot stared at the window but saw nothing. Just his own reflection. And behind it, the faint echo of the last thing she'd said to him in person. "Then I'm not your wife." At the time, he thought it was anger. Now he saw it for what it had been. A declaration. A shift. A beginning. Not hers. His ending. Elsewhere, in a different kitchen, quieter, smaller, softer, Carla placed a new set of mugs into a cupboard. A gift from a neighbor at her temporary residence. She thanked them earlier, briefly, genuinely, before retreating to the silence she had finally earned. On the countertop, a plant someone had left behind in the housing unit sat in filtered sunlight. It was still growing, still reaching, not demanding space, just taking it quietly, like her. And in that moment, no one could take her name from her, not with a laugh, not with a tag, not even with love. Because the knock they didn't expect wasn't a warning. It was a conclusion, one they would spend the rest of their lives trying to rewrite, and she wouldn't need to say a single word more. There was a time when I believed survival meant shrinking, folding into corners, becoming the shadow that slipped between duties and rooms, invisible unless summoned, polite unless questioned, strong only in the quiet places where no one was watching. I believed that patience would one day be rewarded with recognition, that carrying weight in silence was noble, that love was most pure when endured rather than acknowledged. I held doors open, swallowed disrespect as if it were a shared meal, let people drape their comfort over my restraint like it was an offering, not a cost. I learned to nod instead of argue, to compromise instead of correct, to let the world take what it needed from me so that I might be allowed to remain in it. I didn't know back then that I was teaching people how to erase me. I didn't know that by refusing to name my own worth, I was giving others permission to rewrite it. I didn't know until I heard them laugh, heard him laugh, while I stood beside a table where no place had been set for me. Not because there wasn't room, but because there wasn't intention. I was not forgotten. I was removed. But the thing about shadows is they are born of light. And once the source shifts, so does the shape. I didn't explode. I didn't scream. I didn't throw plates or storm out or leave behind a trail of drama for them to follow and mock. I walked, with dignity, with finality, with a ring removed like a uniform no longer fit for the battlefield it once honored. And when I walked, I didn't walk away. I walked toward myself. Toward the version of me I had left waiting too long in the cold, quiet spaces where women like me are told to earn love by disappearing for it. And I never looked back. Now my days begin before the world decides what I'm worth. The light that enters my window doesn't ask permission to exist. It just arrives, golden and unbothered. The uniform that hangs by the door bears my name in full, not as a footnote, not as an accessory to someone else's legacy. I wear it with a posture that no longer bends to survive. I speak in rooms where silence is not demanded but offered, and when I pause, people listen not because they are told to, but because they understand that what comes next will matter. My voice is not a weapon. It is a boundary, a signal, a line that cannot be moved without consequence. I returned to that city once, not for them, but for closure. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce myself. I walked through the old neighborhood, passing homes that once felt like museums of resentment, each window glowing faintly with lives that still revolved around performance. I stood across the street from the house that used to be mine, watching from the quiet anonymity of a parked car. The lights were off. A "for rent" sign swayed slightly in the wind. The porch, once obsessively maintained, had weeds pushing through the cracks. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just watched, still and unshaken, until a man on a bike passed by and nodded at me. I nodded back. That was enough. I started the engine and left, dust rising behind me like the last breath of a chapter closed. I don't hear from them anymore. Not directly. A cousin once sent a message months later, an awkward mix of curiosity and concern, the kind that wasn't really about me, but about the discomfort my absence had left behind. I didn't reply. The silence I built now speaks louder than any attempt at reclamation. And yet I hear the whispers. That he's moved into a smaller place. That she, the mother-in-law who once measured my value by how quiet I could be, is living with a niece now, needing help she once assumed she'd never have to ask for. That Marissa's wedding was postponed indefinitely. That people are asking questions. That the story they tried to write about me doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Not when the news segment lives online. Not when the transcript of my commendation was entered into public record. Not when younger women in the family have started quoting me quietly, subtly, in ways they think no one notices. But I notice, because I no longer flinch when I take up space. And I no longer make myself small for people who confuse silence with virtue. My base has changed. The assignment more permanent now. I was offered a leadership role I didn't ask for, but accepted with measured certainty. I've begun mentoring again, training new recruits, not just in tactics or protocols, but in something deeper, resilience without martyrdom. I tell them that strength is not found in how long you can stay silent, but in how deliberately you choose when to speak. That loyalty is not owed, it is earned. That family, rank, and marriage mean nothing if they cost you the blueprint of your own integrity. That being left out of a dinner table once meant for performative unity can be the first step toward building a life where you never have to ask for a seat again. Some nights, I still wake early, not from nightmares, but from muscle memory, the body remembering what it used to brace for. But I don't reach for the phone anymore. I don't scroll. I don't reread old messages or regret the weight of my own spine. I walk to the window, barefoot, coffee in hand, and I look at the horizon. It doesn't always glow. Some mornings it's fogged in, some clouded over. But even then, I know the light is there. It doesn't owe me warmth. It just exists, consistent, relentless, like me. I keep a journal now, not out of sentimentality but discipline. I write down the names of people I once softened myself for. I don't curse them. I just let the ink do what my voice no longer needs to. I write the dates, the silences, the laughter I remember that shouldn't have happened. I write down the names they called me. Then I write the names I call myself now. I write the rank I earned, the miles I walked, the moments I almost folded and chose instead to breathe, and at the bottom of every page I sign only this: still here, still whole, still mine, and that, more than anything, is the victory.